For 50 years, I poured everything into our marriage, building a home where his dreams came first, while mine gathered dust on shelves I dutifully kept clean. I managed our household with precision, raised our children to respect him, and stood silently behind every career advancement he claimed as his achievement alone. No one sacrificed more for our family than I did, but appreciation never once crossed his lips. Blame, though? Blame found me every single time something went wrong. The day he called me useless after half a century together wasn't just another argument. It was the moment I finally saw the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days later, I walked out of our front door for the last time with nothing but a suitcase and access to every penny we'd saved together. Sometimes the quietest departures leave the loudest echoes. I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unusually warm for October in New Hampshire. I was in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd prepared over 54,000 meals during our marriage. Yes, I calculated it once. 3 meals a day for 50 years, minus the occasional dinner out or hospital stay. The countertops gleamed from the polish I'd applied that morning, the same brand I'd used since 1975, because Richard once mentioned he liked the smell. Richard had retired 8 months earlier from his position as chief financial officer at Northeastern Capital. The transition hadn't been smooth. After 43 years of leaving the house each morning in pressed suits and returning with stories of corporate triumphs, he suddenly found himself adrift in our 4-bedroom colonial with nothing but time. I had prepared for this, of course. I'd subscribed to retirement magazines, joined online groups for corporate wives, and carefully compiled a list of hobbies he might enjoy: golf, woodworking, even cooking classes we could take together. What I hadn't prepared for was his restlessness, the way it clung to him like a second skin, or how that restlessness would gradually transform into resentment that seemed to find its target in me. The woman who had built her entire existence around his comfort was now somehow the source of his discontent. That Tuesday, I was preparing his favorite pot roast, the one my mother had taught me to make when Richard and I were first engaged, in 1972. The carrots were peeled into perfect batons, the potatoes quartered precisely, the meat seared on all sides before being nestled into the Dutch oven he'd given me for our 30th anniversary. As I wiped my hands on my apron, the blue gingham one our daughter Emily had given me last Christmas, I heard the familiar sound of Richard's footsteps on the hardwood floor. "Margaret," he said, not bothering to look up from his iPad as he entered the kitchen. "Did you move my golf clubs again?" His voice had that edge to it, the one that had become more frequent since retirement, like a knife being slowly sharpened against stone. "They're in the garage, Richard, right where you left them after your game with Walter last Thursday," I replied, keeping my voice light, neutral. 50 years of marriage had taught me how to navigate his moods, when to engage and when to simply let the moment pass. He looked up then, his blue eyes, once so warm they could melt the New England snow, now cold as they swept across the kitchen. "I specifically told you I wanted them in the hall closet. How am I supposed to find anything in this house when you're constantly moving things?" I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that came whenever he rewrote history to fit his frustration. He had never mentioned the hall closet. In fact, he had complained just last month that the clubs were taking up too much space inside the house, but I swallowed my correction, as I had thousands of times before. "I'm sorry, dear. I must have forgotten. I'll move them right after dinner." I turned back to the stove, adjusting the heat under the roasting pan. "It'll be ready in about 40 minutes. I made that cornbread you like to go with it." He didn't acknowledge the meal I'd spent 3 hours preparing. Instead, he sighed heavily, the sound filled with 50 years of accumulated disappointment that I somehow had failed to erase despite my best efforts. "What exactly do you do all day, Margaret?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. I turned to face him, wooden spoon still in hand. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, setting his iPad down on the counter with deliberate slowness, "what purpose do you serve now? The kids are grown. I'm retired. This house practically runs itself with all the gadgets we have. The cleaning service comes twice a week. What exactly is your contribution?" Each word landed like a physical blow. 50 years of marriage, of building a life together, reduced to a cost-benefit analysis of my worth. I stood there, frozen, as he continued, seemingly unleashed now that he had started. "Walter's wife has taken up painting since he retired. She's actually quite good, sold 3 canvases at that gallery downtown. And Michael's wife started that successful catering business years ago. Meanwhile, you just exist, floating around this house, moving my things, making meals no one really needs anymore." His voice was eerily calm, as if he were simply stating facts rather than dismantling half a century of shared history. I placed the wooden spoon carefully on the spoon rest, the ceramic one our son Daniel had made in high school art class 30. Years ago, and untied my apron with hands that refused to tremble despite the earthquake happening inside me. "I've taken care of you in this home for 50 years, Richard." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steadier than I felt. "I've managed our household, raised our children, supported your career, volunteered in our community." He waved his hand dismissively, cutting me off mid-sentence. "That was then. I'm talking about now. The children call you, what, once a week? Your volunteer work at the hospital is just reading to patients. Anyone could do that. And as for supporting my career, well, that's over now, isn't it?" I looked at my husband, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in decades. The handsome young accountant with ambitious dreams who had swept me off my feet at a friend's wedding was now a stranger with familiar features. When had that happened? When had we become these people? "I'm 73 years old, Richard. What exactly did you expect me to become at this stage of life?" I asked quietly. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't know, Margaret. Something, anything. Instead of just this." He gestured vaguely in my direction, encompassing all that I was and finding it wanting. "This?" I repeated, the word barely audible. "Useless," he said flatly. "You've become completely useless." The word hung between us, impossible to unhear. In our 50 years together, through financial struggles and health scares, through raising 3 children and burying both sets of parents, he had been short with me, had been thoughtless, had even been cruel at times. But he had never, not once, defined my existence as without value. I turned back to the stove without a word, adjusting the heat under the pot roast that suddenly seemed absurd in its meaninglessness. 50 years of cooking his favorite meals, and he could still look at me and see nothing of value. "I'm going to the club," he said after a moment of heavy silence. "Don't wait up." The front door closed with its familiar sound, the slight stick in humid weather that I'd asked him to fix last summer, and I was alone in the gleaming kitchen that had been the center of my world for 5 decades. I don't know how long I stood there, wooden spoon in hand, staring at nothing. Minutes, perhaps. Or maybe it was hours, time stretching and contracting around that single word. Useless. When I finally moved, it wasn't to finish dinner or to wipe away tears, or even to sit down. Instead, I walked slowly upstairs to our bedroom, each step deliberate. On the carpeted stairs I had replaced just 3 years ago after researching the most durable options for aging knees. Our bedroom was immaculate, as always. The king-sized bed was made with hospital corners, a skill I'd perfected as a volunteer candy striper in high school, long before I met Richard. The duvet was the exact shade of sage green that complemented the cherry wood furniture Richard had inherited from his parents. On his nightstand, the latest John Grisham novel, reading glasses, water carafe. On mine, a framed photo of our 3 children at Emily's graduation from medical school, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A devotional book I read each morning, and a small dish where I placed my wedding and engagement rings each night. I sat on the edge of the bed, my side, always my side for 50 years, and looked at my hands. They were not the hands of a young woman anymore. Veins more prominent, skin thinner, a slight tremor that had developed in recent years. But they were good hands, capable hands. Hands that had rocked 3 babies through sleepless nights. Hands that had packed countless lunches and wrapped Christmas presents and held Richard's hand through his prostate cancer scare 12 years ago. Useless hands, according to my husband of 50 years. I reached for the bedside telephone, the landline we kept just in case, another of my precautions. That Richard mocked as outdated, and dialed a number I rarely used but had memorized nonetheless. Wells Fargo Premier Banking, this is Andrea speaking. How may I help you today? The voice was crisp, professional. Hello, Andrea. This is Margaret Winters, account number 87294-35621. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, focused, businesslike. I'd like to speak with Thomas Harrison, please. Of course, Mrs. Winters. Let me connect you to Mr. Harrison right away. There was a brief hold, soft jazz playing in the background, and then Thomas's familiar voice. Margaret, what a pleasant surprise. It's been, almost a year since we've spoken directly. How are you? I'm well, Thomas. Thank you. The social niceties flowed automatically, ingrained after decades of being Richard's perfect corporate wife. And how is Diane? Did your daughter have her baby yet? Yes. Little Thomas James, our first grandson. 7 pounds, 8 ounces. Diane is over the moon. Practically moved in with them for the first month. That's wonderful. Please give her my congratulations. I paused, then continued in that same strange, steady voice. Thomas, I'm calling because I need to make some changes to our accounts. As you know, I have joint access to everything, but I've generally let Richard handle the details. Yes, of course. Richard has always been particular about your financial arrangements. There was a diplomatic pause. Thomas had been our financial advisor for over 20 years. He knew exactly how particular Richard was about maintaining control. I'd like a complete overview of our current holdings, please, and I'd like to discuss options for establishing accounts in my name only. There was a brief silence on the other end. Thomas was too professional to comment directly, but his voice was careful when he responded. I'd be happy to review everything with you, Margaret. Would you like to schedule an in-person meeting? Perhaps tomorrow morning? That would be perfect. 10 o'clock? I'll have everything prepared, and Margaret. He hesitated. Should I be expecting Richard as well? No, I said simply. This meeting is just for me. After hanging up, I sat motionless on the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl waiting for instructions. The house was silent around me, the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the seconds as they passed. 50 years in this house, and suddenly it felt like a museum dedicated to a life I had never fully lived. I stood up slowly and walked to the closet, the walk-in we had renovated 5 years ago, with his side and my side clearly delineated by the central island of drawers. My side was 1/3 the size of his, my clothing arranged by color and season, each item carefully selected to be appropriate for the wife of Richard Winters, CFO. Nothing too flashy, nothing that would draw attention away from him at corporate events, nothing that would cause raised eyebrows among the country club set. Behind my winter sweaters, on the highest shelf where Richard never looked, was a small leather case. I had to use the step stool to reach it, the same step stool I used when Richard asked me to get his golf shoes down from his side of the closet. The leather was soft under my fingers, worn from years of periodic handling. Inside was everything that remained of Margaret Sullivan, the woman I had been before I became Margaret Winters. A few photographs of my college days at Wellesley, where I'd majored in art history with dreams of working in a museum. Newspaper clippings from the small exhibition of my own paintings that had been displayed in a campus gallery my senior year. A letter offering me an assistant curator position at a small museum in Boston. A letter I had never answered because by then, Richard had proposed, and we both understood that his career would be our priority. Beneath these paper memories was a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my careful handwriting. I had started it on our wedding day, May 15th, 1972, recording the details of the ceremony, my hopes for our future together. For years, I had faithfully documented our life, the purchase of our first home, the births of our children, Richard's, promotions, our travels. But as the decades passed, the entries became shorter, more perfunctory, until they stopped altogether sometime in the late 1990s. The final entry was dated September 3rd, 1998. It read simply, Richard made partner today. Dinner at Le Bernardin with the senior partners. Wore the navy dress. Richard said I was appropriately elegant. Daniel called from college. Needs more money for books. We'll talk to Richard about it tomorrow. That was it. The last written record of my thoughts. After that, silence. As if the woman who had thoughts worth recording had quietly ceased to exist. I closed the journal and returned it to the case, along with the other artifacts of my former self. Then I did something I had never done in 50 years of marriage. I reached for my laptop, the one Richard had given me 3 Christmases ago, mainly so I could look up recipes and send emails to the children, and opened a private browsing window. With careful precision, I typed, How to leave your husband after 50 years of marriage. The search results bloomed across the screen, thousands of entries offering advice, support, cautionary tales. I clicked on the first one, then the second, then the third, reading with the same methodical attention I had once given to planning. Richard's corporate dinner parties. By the time the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, I had read enough to know what my next steps should be. I closed the laptop and returned to the kitchen, where the pot roast had long since finished cooking. I removed it from the oven, covered it with foil, and placed it in the refrigerator. Richard would find it when he returned from the club, whenever that might be. He could heat it up or not. It no longer mattered to me. What mattered was the plan forming in my mind, a plan 50 years in the making, though I hadn't known it until today. A plan that began with a single word, useless, and would end with, well, that remained to be seen. I picked up the telephone again and dialed another memorized number. Emily? It's Mom. My daughter's voice was concerned immediately. I rarely called in the evening, knowing her schedule as a cardiologist kept her busy until late. Mom, is everything okay? Is Dad all right? Your father is fine, I assured her, my voice calm. But I need to ask you something important, and I need you to just listen for a moment without interrupting. Can you do that for me? Of course, she said, concern still evident in her voice. What's going on? I'd like to come stay with you. For a while, starting this weekend. The words came out more easily than I had expected, as if they had been waiting just behind my lips for years. There was a brief silence, and then Emily's voice, careful now. Of course you can stay with me, Mom. Any time. But what's happening? Did you and Dad have a fight? Not exactly. I found myself smiling slightly at the inadequacy of the word fight to describe the seismic shift that had occurred in our kitchen hours earlier. It's more that I've realized something important, and I need some time away to think about what comes next. Mom, you're scaring me a little. You and Dad have been together forever. What? Could possibly 50 years, I interrupted gently. We've been together for 50 years, and in all that time, I've never once taken space for myself. I think it's time, don't you? Another silence, longer this time. My brilliant daughter, who could diagnose complex cardiac conditions in seconds, was struggling to diagnose what was happening with her own mother. "When will you arrive?" she finally asked, accepting what I wasn't explicitly saying. "Friday afternoon, if that works for you." "And Emily? One more thing." "Yes?" "Please don't tell your father we've spoken. I'll explain everything when I see you." "After?" We hung up. I went upstairs and began the careful process of selecting what to take with me. 50 years of accumulation, and suddenly I was reducing my life to what would fit in 2 suitcases. It was both terrifying and strangely liberating. 3 days. I had 3 days to put my plan into motion before Richard would realize what was happening. 3 days to undo 50 years of being the perfect accommodating wife. 3 days to reclaim Margaret Sullivan from the shadow of Margaret Winters. As I folded sweaters and selected comfortable shoes, no longer concerned with whether they were appropriate for Richard's wife, I felt something unfamiliar stirring within me. It took several minutes to identify it, this foreign sensation that made my movements lighter, my breathing easier. It was freedom, the first taste of it in 50 years. And even more surprising than the feeling itself was the realization that accompanied it. I had no intention of ever giving it up again. The Wells Fargo building downtown had always intimidated me. 40 stories of gleaming glass and steel, it stood as a monument to the financial world that Richard had navigated with such confidence while I remained deliberately uninformed. "Don't worry your pretty head about the money, Margaret," he'd say whenever I asked about our investments. "That's my department." For 50 years, I had accepted this division of labor without question. Today, that would change. I had chosen my outfit carefully that morning. A charcoal gray pantsuit I'd purchased for Daniel's law school graduation 3 years earlier, paired with a simple pearl necklace that had been my mother's. Professional, but not showy. The kind of outfit that would make Thomas Harrison take me seriously without thinking I was trying too hard. I had learned these calculations watching Richard dress for success over the decades, though he never knew I was paying such careful attention. Richard had left for his weekly golf game an hour earlier, barely acknowledging my presence beyond asking where he had left his favorite glove. He hadn't mentioned our conversation from 2 days before, the useless conversation, as I had come to think of it. Perhaps he had forgotten it entirely. Perhaps to him, it had been just another Thursday in our long marriage, not the earthquake that had cracked the foundation of my existence. The lobby security guard nodded politely as I passed. Through the metal detector, "Good morning, ma'am. Who are you here to see today?" "Thomas Harrison, Premier Banking, 32nd floor," I replied, my voice steadier than my heartbeat. "Of course. Please sign in here." He pushed a digital tablet toward me as I signed my name. Margaret. Winters, the name I had worn for 50 years like a borrowed coat. I felt a flicker of something rebellious. Perhaps someday soon, I would be signing a different name. My name. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Thomas was waiting for me when the elevator doors opened, his tall frame impeccably suited as always. At 62, he was more than a decade younger than Richard and me, but the gray at his temples gave him a distinguished air that matched his position. "Margaret," he greeted me warmly, extending his hand. "Right on time as always." Punctuality was a cardinal virtue in the Winters household, I replied with a small smile, accepting his handshake. His grip was firm but not overwhelming, respectful. I wondered briefly if Richard had ever really respected me, or if I had just been another acquisition in his carefully curated life. Thomas led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling, windows overlooking the city. The table was polished mahogany, the chairs leather. A younger woman was already seated, a laptop open in front of her. "This is Sophia Chen, one of our legal specialists," Thomas explained as we took our seats. "I thought she might be helpful given what you mentioned on the phone." Sophia nodded professionally. She couldn't have been more than 35, with a sharp bob and sharper eyes that assessed me without judgment. "Mrs. Winters, it's a pleasure to meet you." "Please call me Margaret," I said, surprising myself. Richard had always insisted on formality with service professionals. Mrs. Winters kept a proper distance, but I wasn't feeling very proper today. Thomas opened a leather portfolio and laid several documents on the table between us. "I've prepared a complete overview of your financial situation, as you requested. Before we begin, may I ask what prompted this sudden interest? In the 22 years I've managed your accounts, you've attended perhaps 3 meetings." I appreciated his directness. "Let's just say I've recently realized that being uninformed about my own financial situation was a mistake. One I intend to correct immediately." Thomas nodded, not pushing further. "Well, you've picked a good time for a review. Your portfolio is actually quite healthy." For the next hour, Thomas and Sophia walked me through the labyrinth of our finances, investments, properties, retirement accounts, insurance policies. The numbers were staggering. Richard and primarily Richard, had accumulated over $4.2 million in liquid assets, not including our primary residence valued at $1.8 million, a vacation home in Cape Cod worth $950,000, and various other investments and collectibles. "This is more than I expected," I admitted, trying to absorb the figures before me. "Richard has always been conservative in his spending relative to his income," Thomas explained. "He believed strongly in saving for retirement. A retirement he was now spending calling me useless after I had enabled his every success. The irony wasn't lost on me. "What are my options?" I asked, my fingers tracing the edges of the documents before me. "If I wanted to establish my independence, financially speaking." Thomas and Sophia exchanged a brief glance. "There are several options," Sophia began carefully. "Since all of these accounts are held jointly, you legally have equal access to them. However, any major changes would be visible to your husband as soon as they occurred." "I understand." I had expected as much. Richard checked our accounts obsessively, a habit from his CFO days that retirement had only intensified. "If you're considering a separation," Sophia continued, her voice neutral, professional, "there are ways to ensure you have access to your fair share of the assets while legal proceedings determine the final distribution." The word separation hung in the air, more real now that someone else had spoken it. Was that what I wanted? After 50 years, did I want to end my marriage over a single cruel comment? The answer came with surprising clarity. It wasn't a single comment. It was half a century of small erosions, of being diminished day by day, until useless seemed to Richard at least, like a reasonable assessment of my worth. What if I wanted to access some of these funds without immediate notification to my husband? I asked, my voice hardly above a whisper. Thomas cleared his throat. That would depend on the amount and the account. Certain transactions trigger automatic alerts, especially large withdrawals. But not all? I pressed. Not all, he confirmed, then hesitated before continuing. Margaret, I've known you and Richard for a long time. I hope you don't mind my asking if everything is all right at home? It was the opening I needed. Permission to speak the truth to someone who wasn't family, who might understand the financial implications of what I was considering. Richard called me useless. The words came out flat, matter of fact. After 50 years of marriage, he looked me in the eye and told me I serve no purpose now that he's retired and our children are grown. That I just exist. Thomas's professional demeanor cracked slightly, genuine concern showing through. I'm very sorry to hear that. That must have been devastating. Sophia's expression remained neutral, but her eyes softened. Mrs. Winters, Margaret, financial abuse is sometimes part of emotional abuse. Has your husband restricted your access to money in the past? I hadn't thought of it that way before, as abuse rather than simply the way our marriage worked. He's always controlled the finances. I have a household account for groceries and basic expenses. Any large purchases need to be discussed. I paused, considering. He questions every receipt. He's never increased my personal allowance, not even for inflation, in 30 years. Sophia nodded, making a note on her legal pad. And have you ever worked outside the home? Earned your own income? I taught art at the community center for a few years when the children were in high school. The pay was minimal. Richard called it my little hobby job and suggested I donate the checks to charity for the tax write-off. The memory stung more now than it had at the time. Thomas and Sophia exchanged another glance, this one longer, weighted with professional understanding. Margaret, Thomas said gently, given what you've shared, I think we can help you establish some financial independence without immediately alerting Richard. But I want to be very clear about something. If you're concerned about your safety in any way, we should take different steps. Richard has never been physically abusive, I assured him, though I wondered briefly if that were entirely true. Physical violence wasn't the only kind of harm one person could inflict on another. I just need options. For the next hour, we developed a plan. I would withdraw the maximum amount from our joint checking account that wouldn't trigger an automatic alert, $9,500, and open a new account at a different bank under my name only. I would change the mailing address for certain investment statements to my daughter's home, ensuring those particular funds remained untouched, but also unmonitored by Richard. And most importantly, I would begin the process of securing my own credit history, separate from the joint cards Richard controlled. These are temporary measures, Sophia cautioned as we wrapped up. If you decide to pursue a formal separation or divorce, everything will need to be disclosed eventually. But this gives you breathing room to make decisions without financial pressure. Thank you, I said, gathering the documents they had prepared for me. I appreciate your discretion in this matter. Of course, Thomas replied, standing as I did. And Margaret? For what it's worth, I've observed you for over 20 years now. You've managed your household, raised successful children, supported Richard's career, and maintained the social connections that helped him advance. None of that is useless. It's valuable work that often goes unrecognized. His words warmed something cold inside me. Thank you, Thomas. That means a great deal. As I walked out of the Wells Fargo building into the bright morning sunshine, I felt a strange lightness. The weight of Richard's assessment, useless, had been partially lifted, countered by Thomas's recognition of my contributions. More importantly, I now had a plan. The first steps toward freedom after 50 years of carefully constructed confinement. My next stop was the Middlebrook Community Bank, 15 miles away in a neighboring town where Richard never went. It was small, local, unlikely to appear on any financial statements he would notice. The lobby was modest compared to Wells Fargo's gleaming expanse, but the young banker who helped me, Matthew, according to his nameplate, was thoroughly professional. I'd like to open a new account, I told him, settling into the chair across from his desk. In my name only. Certainly, Mrs. Winters. Checking, savings, or both? Both, please. And I'd like to make an initial deposit. I removed the cashier's thigh. Check I had obtained after leaving Thomas's office. $9,500, the beginning of my independent life. Matthew processed the paperwork efficiently, asking the standard questions about identification and contact information. When we came to the address, I hesitated only briefly before giving Emily's. I'm in transition right now, I explained when he looked up questioningly. This is my daughter's address, where I'll be staying temporarily. If he thought it odd that a woman in her 70s was in transition, he was too professional to show it. And would you like a debit card for this? Account? It would arrive at this address within 7 to 10 business days. Yes, please. A piece of plastic with my name on it, not attached to Richard's primary account. Another small step toward independence. As Matthew finished the paperwork, he explained the bank's online banking features. You can access your account from anywhere with our secure app. Would you like me to help you set that up now? I thought of Richard's occasional habit of checking my phone, ostensibly to help me with technical issues I hadn't asked for help with. Not today, but I appreciate the offer. When I left the bank, my new account information safely tucked into my purse, it was nearly noon. Richard would be finishing his golf game soon, heading to the clubhouse for lunch with his regular foursome. I had at least 2 more hours before I needed to be home, before I needed to resume the role of Margaret Winters, dutiful wife of 50 years. I drove to a small cafe I'd discovered years ago during one of my rare afternoons alone. Nestled between a bookshop and a boutique selling handcrafted jewelry, it was the kind of place Richard would dismiss as pretentious. Exposed brick walls, mismatched vintage furniture, local art hanging on every available surface. I ordered a chai latte and a slice of lemon cake, then found a quiet corner table where I could think. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. Just got your voicemail. Of course you can stay as long as you need. Guest room will be ready. Everything. Okay, worried about you. I typed back. Everything will be fine. I'll explain when I see you. Love you. Then, a moment later, I added, please don't mention this to your father or brothers yet. Her response came quickly. I won't, but I'm concerned. This isn't like you, Mom. That was precisely the point, wasn't it? This wasn't like the Margaret Winters everyone knew, the compliant wife, the supportive mother who never made waves, never asserted her own needs above others. But perhaps it was very much like Margaret Sullivan, the young woman who had once dreamed of curating art collections, who had painted with enough skill to be featured in a campus exhibition, who had received a job offer from a museum before Richard's proposal changed her trajectory. I pulled out a small notebook from my purse. I had always preferred handwritten notes to digital reminders, another habit Richard found quaintly outdated, and began to list the remaining tasks before my departure on Friday. Pack essential clothing and personal items without being obvious. Gather important documents, birth certificate, social security card, marriage license. Transfer jewelry and family heirlooms to safety deposit box, withdraw additional cash for immediate needs, forward important mail to Emily's address. The list was logical, practical, the same approach I had taken to running our household for 50 years. Only now I was applying that methodical efficiency to dismantling my presence within it. As I sipped my chai, I allowed myself to imagine what might come after these initial steps. Would I stay with Emily indefinitely? No, that wouldn't be fair. To her. Would I eventually file for divorce? The thought sent a shiver through me. Divorce at 73, after 50 years of marriage. What would our friends say? The church community? Our children and grandchildren? But then another question surfaced, quieter, but more insistent. What would happen if I stayed? If I returned to our beautiful colonial home with its gleaming countertops and perfect garden, pretending Richard had never spoken that word, useless, aloud? If I continued to prepare his favorite meals and maintain his comfortable routines while slowly disappearing inside myself, day by day, until there was nothing left but the shell of the woman he had deemed without value? The answer came with startling clarity. I would die that way. Not physically, perhaps, but the essential part of me, the part that could still feel joy, curiosity, purpose, would wither away completely. And that would be the true tragedy, not the raised eyebrows or whispered gossip that might follow a separation. I finished my latte and cake, left a generous tip, and walked to my car with renewed determination. 3 more days. 3 days to execute my plan while maintaining the facade of normalcy. 3 days until I would reclaim my life after 50 years of living for someone else. That evening, Richard returned from golf in an unusually good mood. The pro says my swing is improving, he announced as he settled into his recliner, the same spot he had occupied every evening for the past 15 years. Might enter that seniors tournament next month after all. That's wonderful, dear, I replied automatically, placing his scotch, neat, 2 fingers, Glenfiddich, on the side table next to him. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. He nodded absently, already reaching for the remote control. The evening news would play at precisely the volume he preferred, followed by whatever sports event was being broadcast. The routine was as familiar as breathing. I returned to the kitchen, where a roast chicken was finishing in the oven. As I prepared the gravy and vegetables that would accompany it, I marveled at how easy it was to perform these tasks while my mind was elsewhere. Planning, calculating, preparing for a future Richard couldn't begin to imagine. Margaret? His voice carried from the living room, that familiar tone that indicated he wanted something. Yes, Richard? I called back, not pausing in my gravy stirring. Did you pick up my dry cleaning today? The blue blazer for the club dinner tomorrow? I had, of course. It was hanging in his closet, exactly where it always went. Yes, it's in your closet. Good. No thank you. No acknowledgement beyond confirmation that I had completed the assigned task. Useless. The word echoed again, and with it came a surge of something unfamiliar. Not just hurt or anger, but a fierce determination. I would prove him wrong, not by arguing or pleading my case, but by building a life he couldn't touch. The next 2 days passed in a carefully choreographed dance of preparation and pretense. While Richard golfed or met with former colleagues, I methodically gathered documents, transferred small amounts of cash, and packed a single suitcase with essentials, storing it in the back of my closet where he never looked. I made appointments to close out my volunteer shifts at the hospital and the library, citing a need to spend more time with family. I withdrew my remaining balance from the household account Richard allowed me to manage. A paltry sum compared to what I now knew of our total assets, but still mine. Most importantly, I visited our bank's main branch and accessed our safety deposit box, removing my mother's jewelry and the small collection of treasured photographs and letters I had stored there over the years. I left Richard's items untouched: his grandfather's pocket watch, the collector coins he'd inherited, the original deed to our first house. I wasn't seeking to deprive him of his possessions, only to secure my own. On Thursday night, my last night in our home, I prepared Richard's favorite meal: prime rib with Yorkshire pudding, asparagus with hollandaise, and chocolate soufflé for dessert. It was the same menu I had served on our 50th anniversary 6 months earlier, though Richard didn't seem to notice the parallel. "This is good," he commented between bites, his highest form of culinary praise. "What's the occasion?" "No. Occasion?" I replied, smiling slightly. "Just felt like something special tonight." He nodded, returning his attention to his plate. We ate in the dining room, using the good china and silver, candles flickering between us. To an outside observer, we might have looked like the perfect picture of long married contentment, an elegant older couple, comfortable in their shared silence, enjoying a beautiful meal in their beautiful home. Only I knew that this was a farewell dinner. A quiet acknowledgement of 50 years together, even if those years had gradually hollowed me out from the inside. Despite everything, I wanted this final evening to be peaceful. A clean break, rather than a messy, emotional scene. After dinner, as Richard settled in with his scotch and the evening news, I moved through the house one last time. I touched the familiar surfaces: the banister I had polished weekly for decades, the mantel where our children's photographs chronicled their growth, the kitchen counters where I had prepared thousands of meals. Not with regret, but with recognition. This house had been my domain, my prison, my accomplishment, my limitation, all at once. "I think I'll turn in early," I told Richard around 9. "I didn't sleep well last night." He glanced up briefly. "All right. Don't forget to set the alarm." "I won't." I paused in the doorway, studying his profile. Still handsome at 75, his white hair full, his posture straight. The man I had devoted my life to, who had just days ago deemed that devotion worthless. "Good night, Richard." "Night," he replied, already focused back on the television. Upstairs, I completed my final preparations. I sent a text to Emily confirming my arrival time tomorrow. I placed my wedding and engagement rings in the small dish on my nightstand, where they would remain when I left. I laid out clothes for the morning, comfortable traveling attire, nothing that would signal to Richard that this day would be different from any other. Then, I slipped into bed beside my husband of 50 years for the last time, closed my eyes, and waited for sleep to come. Tomorrow would be the first day of whatever remained of my life, a life reclaimed, a life of my own choosing. Whatever came, next I would no longer be useless. I would be free. Friday morning dawned with a crystalline autumn clarity that seemed fitting for new beginnings. I woke before Richard, as I had every day of our married life, but instead of immediately starting his coffee and preparing his preferred breakfast, I lay still and listened to his steady breathing beside me. For half a century, that sound had been the backdrop to my existence. After today, I might never hear it again. The thought brought neither sadness nor regret, only a strange, floating sensation of possibility. I slipped from bed at my usual time, 6:15 a.m., and followed what appeared to be my normal morning routine: coffee brewing, English muffins toasting, the morning paper retrieved from the front step. Richard would never suspect that each movement was choreographed, each ordinary action concealing an extraordinary purpose. "You're quiet this morning," he commented as he buttered his muffin, the Wall Street Journal propped against the coffee carafe in front of him. His eyes never left the financial section. "Just thinking about the day ahead," I replied truthfully. "I have some errands to run," he nodded absently. "Don't forget we have the Hendersons coming for bridge tomorrow night. We'll need something for dessert." I almost laughed at the irony. "I won't forget," I assured him, knowing I would be halfway to Emily's by then, my absence an explanation yet to be discovered. "Good." He folded his paper and stood. "I'm meeting Walter at the range this morning. Then we have a finance committee meeting at the club at 11. Should be home around 3. Perfect. Exactly as I had anticipated based on his usual Friday schedule. "Have a good day, dear," I said, the familiar phrase automatic after decades of daily partings. He paused in the doorway, glancing back with a slight furrow between his brows. "Are you feeling all right? You seem different." My pulse quickened, but my expression remained placid. "Just a little tired. Nothing to worry about." He studied me for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Take a nap this afternoon." "I don't want you worn out for bridge tomorrow." "I'll do that," I promised, knowing it was the last lie I would tell him. When the front door closed behind him and his car pulled out of the driveway, I allowed myself 10 seconds of stillness, breathing deeply, acknowledging the magnitude of what I was about to do. Then I moved into action with the efficiency that had made me the perfect corporate wife for 50 years. First, the letter I had composed and rewritten a dozen times, now sealed in an envelope with Richard's name written in my neat script. I placed it on his pillow where he would be sure to find it tonight. Not a long letter, no itemized list of grievances accumulated over half a century, just a clear explanation that I was leaving, that I was safe, and that I would contact him when I was ready to discuss the future of our marriage. Next, I retrieved my packed suitcase from the back of my closet and added the last few items: my toiletries, the book from my nightstand, the small framed photo of our 3 children that normally sat on my dresser. I changed into comfortable traveling clothes, a far cry from the tailored outfits Richard preferred I wear even for mundane tasks. Finally, I did something I had never done in 50 years of marriage. I wrote a check from our joint account for $50,000, made out to myself. After my discussions with Thomas and Sophia, I knew this was legally my right. Half of our marital assets were mine by law, but the act still felt momentous, almost transgressive. I would deposit it in my new account later today, establishing a more substantial foundation for whatever came next. At 10:30 a.m., exactly according to plan, a taxi pulled into our circular driveway. Not an Uber or Lyft that might leave a digital trail on our shared accounts, but an old-fashioned taxi paid for with cash. The driver, a weathered man in his 60s, loaded my single suitcase into the trunk without comment. The train station. Please, I directed him as I settled into the back seat. One last glance at the colonial house that had been my domain for 38 years, the pristine landscaping, the gleaming windows, the American flag Richard insisted we display year-round. A beautiful prison I had maintained to perfection. Heading somewhere nice? The driver asked as we pulled away. Yes, I said simply. Somewhere new. The train station was bustling with Friday morning commuters, young professionals in sleek business attire, worlds away from my suburban existence. I purchased my ticket with cash and found a bench to wait, my suitcase at my feet, my purse clutched perhaps too tightly in my lap. I felt conspicuous, certain that everyone who glanced my way could somehow read "runaway wife" emblazoned across my forehead. But of course, I was just another older woman traveling alone, unremarkable among the crowds of people with their own destinations and preoccupations. The train arrived precisely on schedule, silver and gleaming in the late morning sun. As I settled into my seat by the window, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over me. The last time I had taken a train alone had been 52 years ago, traveling from Wellesley to Boston for that job interview at the museum. The job I never took because Richard proposed the following weekend. How different might my life have been if I had boarded this same train all those decades ago with a different purpose? The journey passed in a blur of autumn scenery and swirling thoughts. I had texted Emily when I left the house, a simple message. On my way, ETA 1:30. Her response had been immediate. Doors unlocked if I'm still at the hospital. Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home. When was the last time I had felt truly at home anywhere? The house I had just left had been a showcase for Richard's success, every detail curated to reflect his taste, his status, his comfort. Even my personal spaces, my small art desk in the sunroom, my reading chair in the bedroom corner, existed. Within parameters he had established. The train pulled into the station exactly on time. I gathered my belongings and stepped onto the platform, immediately spotting Emily waiting near the station entrance. At 43, she was a striking figure, tall like her father but with my coloring, her dark hair now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples. Her white coat was draped over her arm, suggesting she had come directly from the hospital. "Mom," she called, waving as she caught sight of me. Then she was moving toward me, concern etched across her features. "I wasn't sure you'd really come." "I wasn't entirely sure either," I admitted as she enfolded me in a hug. "Until this morning." She pulled back, studying my face intently. "What happened? Is Dad okay? Are you sick?" "Let's talk at your place," I suggested, suddenly aware of the curious glances from passing strangers. "It's a longer conversation than we should have here." The drive to Emily's apartment was mercifully brief. She lived in an elegant high-rise. In the heart of the city, her successful career as a cardiologist affording her luxuries I had only experienced through Richard's provision. The doorman greeted her by name, his eyes flickering curiously to me before he helped bring my modest luggage inside. Her apartment was exactly as I remembered from my infrequent visits, minimalist, pristine, with stunning views of the city skyline. Artwork adorned the walls, not the safe traditional pieces that hung in our house, but bold modern paintings that made statements rather than merely filling space. It struck me suddenly that my daughter, in her independent life, had created something completely her own, something I had never done. "Sit, Mom. Please." Emily gestured to the sleek sofa. "Can I get you anything?" Water? Tea? Something stronger? Tea. Would be lovely, I said, settling onto the surprisingly comfortable couch. She disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a steaming mug of Earl Grey. She remembered my preference without being told. Then she sat opposite me, her expression a mixture of concern and patience. Dad called me useless. The words came out more abruptly than I had intended, with none of the careful preamble I had rehearsed on the train. After 50 years of marriage, he told me I serve no purpose now. Emily's face registered shock, then anger. He what? When did this happen? Tuesday. Had it really been only 3 days? It felt like months had passed since that moment in the kitchen. He came in asking about his golf clubs, then suddenly started questioning what I actually do all day, what purpose I serve now that he's retired and you children are grown. That's horrible, Emily said, her doctor's composure cracking, and completely untrue. What did you say to him? Very little, in the moment. I was too shocked, but it made me realize something important. I took a sip of tea, gathering my thoughts. Your father has never valued my contributions to our marriage or our family. He's tolerated them, expected them, but never truly seen them as worthwhile. Emily started to speak, but I held up my hand. Let me finish, please. This isn't just about one cruel comment. It's about 50 years of small dismissals that I accepted, because that's what wives of my generation were taught to do. It's about realizing at 73 that I have allowed myself to become exactly what he accused me of being, someone who exists rather than lives. My daughter was silent for a long moment, absorbing my words. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. What are you going to do, Mom? Is this a temporary separation or… I don't know yet, I admitted. I've taken some steps, opened my own bank account, gathered important documents. But beyond staying with you for a little while, I haven't made any definite plans. You can stay as long as you need, she assured me quickly. But what about Dad? Does he know you've left? I left a letter. He'll find it when he gets home this evening. Emily's eyes widened. So he doesn't know yet? Mom, he's going to be frantic. Whatever he said, however hurtful, disappearing like… This… I haven't disappeared, I corrected her firmly. I've removed myself from an unhealthy situation. There's a difference. And I was very clear in my letter that I'm safe and will contact him when I'm ready. She looked unconvinced. He's going to call me, you know. And Daniel and James. What should we tell him? The truth. That I'm staying with you, that I'm safe, and that I need some time. I set my mug down on the glass coffee table. But I don't want to discuss my plans or whereabouts beyond that, not until I've had time to think. Emily nodded slowly, her clinical detachment returning. Okay, I can respect that. She hesitated, then added, But Mom, you've never done anything like this before. I'm worried about you. I smiled, feeling a strange sense of calm. I know, and that's precisely the problem. In 73 years, I've never put myself first. It's time I started. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text message, then another, and another in rapid succession. I didn't need to look to know who they were from. That will be your father, I said, making no move to check the messages. He must have come home early and found my letter. Emily's expression grew troubled. Aren't you going to answer him? Not yet. I took another sip of tea, surprised by my own steadiness. He's had my undivided attention for 50 years. He can wait a few days for my response. Mom. Emily seemed at a loss for words, caught between concern for me and lifelong respect for her father. This isn't like you. No, I agreed. It isn't like the mother you've known. But perhaps it's like the woman I was meant to be all along? The buzzing continued, insistent, demanding. Richard had never tolerated being ignored. By colleagues, by subordinates. certainly not by his wife. The thought of him pacing our pristine kitchen, growing increasingly agitated as his texts went unanswered, would once have sent me into a panic of anxious accommodation. Now it merely confirmed I had made the right decision. "Would you like to rest?" Emily asked after a moment, recognizing, perhaps, that I was not going to engage with the barrage of messages. "The guest room is all made up, or we could go out for an early dinner if you're hungry." The second option startled me. In our marriage, Friday evenings had a fixed pattern. Drinks at 6, dinner at 7, usually at home unless Richard had a specific restaurant in mind. The idea of simply deciding on impulse to go out for dinner felt foreign, almost illicit. "Actually," I said slowly, "I think I'd like to go out. Somewhere new, somewhere I've never been before." Emily smiled, visibly relieved to have a concrete way to help. "I know just the place. Lebanese food? Have you ever tried it?" "No." In 50 years of marriage, our culinary adventures had been limited to Richard's preferences: steakhouses, Italian restaurants, the occasional French bistro when he was feeling cosmopolitan. That sounds perfect. As we prepared to leave, my phone finally fell silent. No doubt Richard would soon be calling our children, demanding information, perhaps even contacting friends or neighbors in his search for me. The Margaret of 3 days ago would have been mortified at causing such disruption, such potential embarrassment. But the woman who had left her wedding rings on the nightstand, who had written a $50,000 check to herself, who had walked away, from 50 years of certainty toward an unmapped future, that woman felt only a growing sense of liberation with each step further from her former life. "Ready?" Emily asked, car keys in hand. I took a deep breath, savoring the unfamiliar sensation of answering only to myself. "Yes," I said simply. "I'm ready." And for the first time in half a century, it was absolutely true. The Lebanese restaurant was a revelation. Small, family-owned, with tables covered in vibrant cloths and walls adorned with intricate tapestries, it couldn't have been further from the staid country club dining room where Richard and I had spent countless Friday evenings. The aromas were intoxicating: garlic, lemon, unfamiliar spices that made my nose tingle pleasantly. Emily ordered for us both, her familiarity with the menu another small surprise. My daughter had developed tastes and preferences I knew nothing about. A life completely separate from the carefully prescribed existence Richard and I had created. I wondered what else I had missed while living within the narrow confines of my marriage. "Try the baba ganoush first," Emily suggested, spreading the smoky eggplant dip onto warm flatbread and passing it to me. "It's incredible here." I took a cautious bite, then a more enthusiastic one. "This is wonderful," I said, genuinely delighted by the new flavors. Richard would hate it. The words slipped out without thought, but instead of dampening the mood, they made both of us laugh, a moment of unexpected lightness in what had been an emotionally charged day. "Dad's culinary bravery begins and ends with trying a new steakhouse," Emily agreed, her smile fading slightly as she studied my face. "Mom, I have to ask, are you really okay? This is all so sudden." I considered the question as I sampled more of the feast spread before us. Was I okay? Intellectually, I understood I was in the midst of upending my entire life, an objectively stressful situation. Yet I felt strangely calm, almost buoyant. "I think I'm better than I've been in years," I answered honestly. "It's as if I've been holding my breath for decades without realizing it, and now I can finally exhale." Emily nodded slowly. "I've never seen you like this before. More present somehow." "I've spent 50 years being what your father needed me to be," I said, the insight crystallizing as I spoke. "I'm curious to discover who I actually am when I'm not reflecting someone else's expectations." Our conversation flowed easily after that, touching on Emily's work, her recent research publication, the art exhibit she planned to visit that weekend. Not once did she ask about my plans or try to steer me toward a reconciliation with Richard, a restraint I deeply appreciated. The bill arrived, and I reached for my purse automatically, the habit of decades making me the designated keeper of day-to-day finances even as Richard controlled the larger picture. Emily waved me off. "My treat, Mom. I invited you, remember? Such a simple thing, being treated to a meal. And yet, it felt momentous. When was the last time someone had taken care of me rather than the reverse?" "Thank you," I said, the words catching slightly in my throat. As we left the restaurant, the crisp evening air carried a hint of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Autumn in New England had always been my favorite season, the world aflame with color before the long white silence of winter. This year, for the first time, I wouldn't be preparing the house for winter, arranging for the gutters to be cleaned, storing the patio furniture, scheduling the furnace maintenance. The thought was both disorienting and exhilarating. "Would you like to walk a bit before heading back?" Emily asked, gesturing toward a small park across the street. "It's a beautiful evening." Another simple choice that would have been impossible in my previous life. Evening walks were taken with Richard at precisely 6:30 p.m., weather permitting, around our neighborhood for exactly 30 minutes. Spontaneous strolls in unfamiliar parks after dinner? Unthinkable. "I'd love to," I said, linking my arm through hers. The park was alive with early evening activity. Young couples on benches, children squeezing in final minutes of play before bedtime, elderly men playing chess at permanent tables. We found an empty bench facing a small pond where ducks glided peacefully across the darkening water. "Dad called while you were freshening up before dinner," Emily said after we'd sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. I didn't want to mention it earlier and spoil our meal. I had been expecting this, of course. "What did he say?" "He was—" She hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Upset, confused. He wanted to know if you were with me, if you were all right." "And you told him the truth?" "Yes, that you're safe and staying with me for a while." She turned to face me directly. "Mom?" He sounded genuinely bewildered. He kept saying he didn't understand what had happened, that everything was fine when he left this morning. I wasn't surprised. In Richard's worldview, everything had been fine. His needs were met, his comfort assured, his life proceeding exactly as he'd designed it. The fact that I had been slowly disappearing within that carefully constructed framework was irrelevant, as long as the framework itself remained intact. "Did he mention our conversation on Tuesday?" I asked. "When he called me useless?" Emily shook her head. "No. He just kept asking what he'd done wrong, why you would leave out of the blue after 50 years. A cold anger settled in my chest, different from the hot flashes of resentment I'd suppressed throughout our marriage. "That's very convenient for him, isn't it? To forget the catalyst for my departure? Maybe he genuinely doesn't remember," Emily suggested gently. "You know how Dad can be when he's frustrated. He says things without thinking. And that's supposed to excuse it?" The edge in my voice surprised us both. "For 50 years I've accommodated his moods, smoothed over his harsh words, maintained his comfortable existence while sublimating my own needs. And the one time I prioritize myself, suddenly his memory fails him." Emily was silent, her expression troubled. I took a deep breath, softening my tone. "I'm not angry with you, sweetheart. But this is exactly why I needed to leave. Your father has never had to consider the impact of his words or actions on me because I've never held him accountable for them. That ends now." My phone vibrated in my pocket. Again, Richard, no doubt. I ignored it, as I had the dozens of calls and texts. Throughout the afternoon and evening. "He says he's driving up tomorrow morning," Emily said carefully. "He wants to talk to you face to face." The old Margaret would have panicked at this announcement. would have immediately begun planning how to manage Richard's emotions, how to minimize the disruption, how to restore equilibrium as quickly as possible. The woman sitting on this park bench felt only a steely resolve. "No," I said simply. "No?" Emily looked startled. "I'm not ready to see him yet. This isn't about what he wants or when he wants it. For once, this is about what I need. What should I tell him when he arrives? He has my address, Mom. He'll just show up." I considered this, weighing options I would never have contemplated before Tuesday. Tell him I've gone out for the day. That I'll contact him when I'm ready to talk, and not before. And Emily, I placed my hand over hers. You don't have to manage this situation for either of us. This is between your father and me. Her relief was visible. Okay, I can do that. We walked back to her apartment as the streetlights flickered on, casting pools of gold on the sidewalk. The evening had a dreamlike quality. My first night of genuine freedom in half a century, in a city I barely knew, with a future entirely unwritten. I slept deeply in Emily's guest room, without the interrupted rest that had characterized my nights for years. No Richard snoring to work around, no 3 a.m. trips to the bathroom that required silent navigation to avoid disturbing him, no early alarm to ensure his breakfast was ready precisely when he expected it. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar curtains, and for a moment, I felt completely disoriented. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, along with an unexpected feeling. Anticipation. For the first time in decades, I had no prescribed schedule to follow, no one's needs to prioritize above my own. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, a habit too ingrained to break overnight, and saw the digital evidence of Richard's escalating distress. 37 missed calls, 19 voicemails, 42 text messages. The timestamps showed they had continued well past midnight. Sitting up in bed, I listened to the first voicemail, Richard's voice tight with controlled anger. "Margaret, this is absolutely unacceptable. Call me immediately." The second, "Where are you? Emily's not answering either. What kind of game are you playing?" The third, his tone shifting to confusion. "Margaret, please. I don't understand what's happening. Whatever I did, we can talk about it. Just come home." I deleted the rest, without listening. The text followed a similar pattern, from commanding to pleading. One caught my eye. "Is this about what I said on Tuesday? I was just frustrated about the golf clubs. You know I didn't mean it." There it was. The closest Richard would come to acknowledging his cruelty, framing it as a mere moment of frustration, something I should understand and forgive, as I had forgiven thousands of small and large wounds over the decades. Not this time. I set the phone aside and prepared for the day, borrowing Emily's shower gel that smelled of jasmine rather than the unscented soap Richard preferred. Small acts of self-determination, insignificant to anyone else but revolutionary to me. Emily had already left for the hospital, a note on the kitchen counter explaining she had an early surgery and would be home by 3. There was fresh coffee, in the pot, bagels in a basket, her address scribbled at the bottom of the note in case I wanted to explore the neighborhood. I was pouring a second cup of coffee when the buzzer sounded. A glance at the clock confirmed it was only 9:15 a.m., too early for Emily to have returned, too early for any reasonable visitor. Richard, then. Ignoring Emily's message that I wasn't ready to see him, arriving at the crack of dawn to force a confrontation on his terms, some things never changed. The buzzer sounded again, more insistent this time. I set my coffee cup down with deliberate care and approached the intercom, pressing the button that would allow me to speak without granting access. "Yes?" My voice was steadier than I had expected. "Margaret." Richard's voice, instantly recognizable, despite the electronic distortion. "Let me up. We need to talk." "I'm not ready to talk yet, Richard. I explained that in my letter. This is ridiculous." His frustration was palpable, even through the tinny speaker. I drove 4 hours to get here. You can't just throw away 50 years of marriage without a conversation. I'm not throwing away anything, I replied calmly. I'm taking time to think about what those 50 years have meant, and what I want the rest of my life to look like. When I'm ready to discuss it with you, I'll let you know. Margaret, don't make me stand out here making a scene. The doorman is staring. Is that what you want? For people to know our private business? There it was. The threat of social embarrassment, his most reliable tool for controlling my behavior throughout our marriage. The scandal of a husband who couldn't manage his wife, forced to plead for entry in a public lobby. Once that would have been enough to make me capitulate immediately. What I want, I said clearly, is for you to respect my request for space. Go home, Richard. I'll call you when I'm ready. Let me up, Margaret. Now. His voice had hardened, the conciliatory tone vanishing. This was the voice he used with subordinates who had disappointed him, with service people who had failed to meet his standards. It had never failed to make me flinch inwardly, to scramble to appease. Today, it merely confirmed my decision. No, I said simply. Goodbye, Richard. I released the intercom button, cutting off his response. The buzzer sounded, again and again and again, a staccato testament to his disbelief that I had actually refused him. I returned to my coffee, hands trembling slightly but resolve intact. My phone rang immediately. The doorman, no doubt, reporting that my husband was demanding entry. I silenced it without answering. Then came the texts, first from Richard, then from the building's security desk, asking if they should call the police to remove the distressed gentleman in the lobby. I responded only to the security message. Please tell him I am not available and will not be available today. If he refuses to leave, you have my permission to take whatever steps are necessary. 15 minutes later, my phone pinged with a final text from Richard. This isn't over, Margaret. When you're done with this childish stunt, we'll discuss how to repair the damage you've caused. I read it twice, struck by the familiar pattern. My actions were childish, while his were reasonable. I had caused damage that needed repair. Always the framework that positioned him as the rational authority, and me as the problematic element requiring correction. For the first time, I saw this dynamic with perfect clarity, as if I were observing our relationship through glass rather than fog. And with that clarity came another revelation. I didn't have to participate in this exchange anymore. I didn't have to defend, explain, or justify. I could simply choose a different path. I deleted his message without responding, set my phone aside, and picked up the notepad where Emily had written her address. It was time to explore my surroundings, to begin the process of discovering what Margaret, just Margaret, not Mrs. Richard Winters, might enjoy on a beautiful autumn Saturday, when the entire day belonged to her alone. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt something that had been absent for decades. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but its essential precursor, possibility. Whatever came next would be my choice, shaped by my desires rather than someone else's expectations. Richard was right about one thing. This wasn't over, but it would never return to what it had been. That chapter was closed. The page turned to something new and entirely mine. The city in autumn was a tapestry of sensations I had forgotten existed. Street musicians playing jazz on corners, the rich aroma of coffee drifting from bustling cafes, the satisfying crunch of fallen leaves beneath my feet. I walked without destination or purpose, a liberty so foreign it felt almost illicit. 3 blocks from Emily's apartment, I discovered a small art gallery tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop. The window display featured bold, abstract paintings, splashes of red and gold against deep blue backgrounds. Without Richard's disapproving presence, he had always dismissed abstract art as pretentious nonsense. I stepped inside. Just browsing, I told the young woman who greeted me, expecting the polite disinterest retail workers typically showed women my age. Instead, she smiled warmly. Take your time. The artist is actually here today if you have any questions. She gestured toward a tall woman in her 60s arranging wine glasses on a small table. We're setting up for a reception this afternoon, but you're welcome to look around. The artist, Camille, according to the exhibition brochure, noticed my interest in a large canvas dominated by swirling crimson shapes that seemed to be simultaneously dancing and breaking apart. That one's called Emergence, she said, approaching, with a glass of water in hand. It's about finding form after dissolution. I studied the painting more closely. It's beautiful, unsettling but hopeful somehow. She tilted her head, appraising me with curious eyes. That's exactly what I was trying to capture. Most people just see the chaos. Perhaps you have to have experienced dissolution to recognize the possibility of emergence, I replied, surprising myself with the candor. Camille smiled, extending her hand. I'm Camille Sorvino, and you have the look of someone in the midst of emergence yourself. I introduced myself using my maiden name, Sullivan, for the first time in 50 years. The syllables felt strange on my tongue, like trying on clothes. I had outgrown long ago. First time using that name in a while? Camille asked perceptively. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been there. She gestured to the painting again. This was my post-divorce piece. 38 years with a man who thought my art was a cute hobby, not a legitimate career. The day I sold my first painting for 5 figures, he called it beginner's luck. The parallel to my own situation was so striking I laughed out loud. My husband called me useless after 50 years of marriage. 3 days later, I left with access to our entire savings. Instead of the shock or judgment I might have expected, Camille grinned. Good for you. Better late than never. She glanced at her watch. Listen, our reception starts in an hour. Nothing formal, just wine and conversation. Why don't you stay? I think you might enjoy meeting some of the other artists. An invitation to a social event not vetted and approved by Richard? Another first. I'd like that, I said, realizing I meant it. The reception turned out to be a revelation. The gallery, filled with people of all ages, artists, collectors, students, retirees like myself looking for new interests. I sipped white wine, not Richard's preferred red, and found myself drawn into conversations about color theory, creative process, the city's art scene. No one asked about my husband or children. No one expected me to play the supporting role I had inhabited for 5 decades. I was simply Margaret, a woman interested in art. By evening, I had exchanged phone numbers with Camille and 2 other women, Diana, a retired English professor who led a book club for seniors, and Patricia, a widowed former nurse who had reinvented herself as a ceramics artist at 68. We meet for coffee every Wednesday, Patricia told me as we exchanged information. Nothing formal, just women of a certain age who aren't done living yet. You should join us. Women who weren't done living yet. The phrase echoed in my mind as I walked back to Emily's apartment, the setting sun painting the city in hues that reminded me of Camille's artwork. Was that who I was becoming? A woman with a future still to be written, rather than merely a past to be maintained? The doorman nodded respectfully as I entered the building. Your husband left about an hour after you did, ma'am. Said to tell you he's staying at the Marriott downtown if you change your mind. If I change my mind, as if my departure had been a whim, a momentary lapse in judgment, rather than the most clear-eyed decision I had made in decades. Thank you, I replied simply. I won't be needing that information. Emily was home when I returned, chopping vegetables in the sleek kitchen while classical music played softly in the background. She looked up, relief evident in her expression. There you are. I was starting to worry when you didn't answer my texts. I pulled my phone from my purse, discovering it had died hours ago. Another small rebellion, being unreachable, unaccountable. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I lost track of time at an art gallery reception. Her eyebrows rose. An art reception? You've been gone 6 hours. I met some fascinating women, I explained, setting my purse on the counter and picking up a knife to help with dinner preparations. Artists? Professors? Women who've reinvented themselves later in life. Emily studied me curiously. You seem different, energized. I feel different. I began slicing mushrooms with the precision I had always applied to household tasks. For the first time in forever, I'm not considering someone else's preferences before my own. It's intoxicating. Dad came by, she said after a moment. He was upset when I told him you were out. The doorman mentioned he's staying at the Marriott. He wants to have dinner tomorrow night, the 3 of us. Emily's tone was carefully neutral. I told him I'd ask you. I considered this as I finished with the mushrooms and moved on to mincing garlic. What do you think I should do? Emily looked startled by the question. Me? I don't know, Mom. It's between you and Dad. But you have an opinion, I pressed gently. I'd like to hear it. She set down her knife, turning to face me directly. Honestly, I think you should hear him out, but on your terms, not his. Neutral territory, clear boundaries, limited time. Her professional demeanor softened. And I think whatever you decide. About your marriage, you shouldn't rush back to the status quo. I've never seen you like this before. Independent, making your own choices. It suits you. I nodded, touched by her insight and support. Thank you, Emily. That means more than you know. Later that evening, after dinner and comfortable conversation, I sat in the guest room with a notepad, composing a message to Richard. Not a reply to his dozens of texts and calls, but a new communication, on my terms. Richard, I will meet you for lunch tomorrow at noon at the cafe across from Emily's building. 1 hour, just the 2 of us. This is not a negotiation about my return. It is a conversation about how we proceed from here, respectfully and fairly. Margaret Short, clear, without the apologetic tone that had characterized my communications with him for 50 years. I sent it before I could second-guess myself, then turned off my phone entirely. The next morning I woke with purpose rather than anxiety. After breakfast with Emily, I walked to a nearby department store. Another first, shopping without Richard's implicit or explicit approval of my choices. I selected a simple but elegant outfit in deep teal, a color Richard had always claimed. Washed me out, but that I had secretly loved. Special occasion? The sales associate asked as she rang up my purchase. Yes, I replied, a small smile playing at my lips. I'm meeting my husband to discuss the terms of our separation. Her eyes widened slightly, but to her credit, she recovered quickly. Well, you'll certainly be doing it in style. As I left the store, purchases in hand, my phone buzzed in my purse. Turned back on this morning to a single text from Richard, acknowledging our meeting. No pleas, no demands, just I'll be there. Perhaps he was finally realizing that the dynamics between us had fundamentally changed. The autumn sun was bright overhead as I approached Emily's building, my new outfit a kind of armor for the confrontation ahead. I felt none of the trepidation that had marked difficult conversations with Richard in the past. No racing heart, no twisting stomach, no mental rehearsal of placating phrases. Instead, I felt a quiet certainty. Whatever happened at lunch, whatever Richard said or threatened or promised, I would not be returning to the life I had left. That Margaret, the accommodating shadow built to reflect a man's expectations, had dissolved, like the swirling shapes in Camille's painting. And from that dissolution, something new was emerging, something entirely my own. Richard was already seated when I arrived at the cafe, his back military straight, his silver hair freshly trimmed. He stood when he saw me, a reflex of the social polish that had always impressed others but masked a very different private demeanor. Margaret. His voice held that careful neutrality he used during corporate negotiations. You look different. I am different, I replied, settling into the chair across from him. The teal outfit felt like a declaration. I had chosen it. For myself, without consideration for his preferences. He studied me, eyes narrowing slightly as he processed changes too subtle for him to name, but significant enough to register as foreign. I've been worried sick. You never answered my calls. I needed space to think clearly, without your influence. I opened the menu, a small act of independence, choosing my own meal without first checking what he planned to order. This is absurd. Margaret, 50 years of marriage. And you walk out over one comment? His control was slipping already, the facade of reasonableness thinning to reveal the entitlement beneath. If this is about Tuesday, fine, I apologize. I was frustrated about the golf clubs. I set the menu down, meeting his gaze directly. This isn't about golf clubs, Richard. It's about half a century of me disappearing into your shadow. Useless. Was simply the final revelation that you've never truly seen me or valued my contributions. That's not fair, he countered, leaning forward. I've given you everything. A beautiful home, financial security, social status. What more could you possibly want? To exist as more than an extension of you. The simplicity of the answer seemed to startle him. To make choices based on my own preferences, not yours. To be valued for who I am, not how well I serve your needs. The waiter approached, and I ordered a Mediterranean salad with sparkling water, neither of which Richard would have approved as appropriate lunch choices. He ordered a club sandwich with obvious irritation at the interruption. What exactly do you want from me, Margaret? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. I was wrong to say what I did. Now, can we please put this behind us? The Hendersons had to cancel bridge last night. I had to make excuses to everyone. It's embarrassing. Of course that would be his concern. The social embarrassment, not the pain he had caused. I'm not coming home, Richard. Not now. Possibly not ever. He went completely still, the practiced poise vanishing. What are you talking about? Of course. You're coming home. Where else would you go? What would you do? That's what I'm discovering. I took a sip of water, warming to my theme. Did you know I spent yesterday at an art reception? Met women my age who are artists, professors, business owners, women living on their own terms, divorced women, widows. His tone was dismissive. Is that what you want to become? Some sad, lonely old woman with cats and hobbies? I almost laughed at the predictability of his response. I'd rather be a woman with cats and hobbies than a woman with no identity beyond being your wife. Our food arrived, creating a momentary pause in the tension. Richard stabbed at his sandwich with uncharacteristic aggression while I calmly dressed my salad. You can't access our accounts, you know, he said after several bites, his trump card, finally revealed. I called the bank yesterday, put a freeze on everything. I'm aware, I replied, the serenity in my voice genuine. Thomas Harrison called to inform me of your actions. He also reminded me that freezing joint accounts without both parties' consent is legally questionable. The freeze will be lifted by tomorrow. Richard's jaw tightened. You spoke to Thomas? Behind my back? I spoke to our financial advisor about our joint finances. Yes. I met his gaze steadily. I also transferred $50,000 to my personal account before you implemented the freeze. Perfectly legal, as Thomas confirmed. The color drained from his face. You had no right? I had every right, I interrupted firmly. Half of our assets are legally mine, Richard. My contribution to our marriage may not have generated a paycheck, but it enabled your career and built our life together. I'm not asking for more than my fair share, but I won't accept less either. For perhaps the first time in our 50 years together, Richard seemed genuinely speechless. The reality was sinking in. I was not coming back, at least not to the arrangement we had maintained for decades. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice uncharacteristically small. "I'm going to rent an apartment in the city, near Emily, near my new friends. I'll have my attorney contact you about a formal separation agreement. We can divide our assets equitably, without drama." "And if I contest it?" I smiled slightly. "You won't." "Not once your lawyer explains how a contentious divorce would affect your reputation in the community, not to mention dividing your precious assets in ways you can't control." He fell silent again, the remains of his sandwich forgotten. I finished my salad unhurriedly, savoring each bite as if it were my first real meal. When I finally rose to leave, Richard reached for my hand, a gesture so unexpected I almost yielded to it. "Margaret, please. I don't know how to live without you." The admission, perhaps the most honest he had ever made, touched something in me, not enough to change my course, but enough to soften my response. "That's exactly the problem, Richard. You never had to learn. And I never had the chance to find out who I could be on my own." I gently withdrew my hand. Maybe it's time we both discovered what we're truly capable of. I walked out of the cafe into the bright autumn sunshine, each step lighter than the last. Ahead lay uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. The first pages of a story that was finally, truly, mine to write. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.